Sure.
welcome your comments. And we move on to Dr. Margot Kuchel. She's a professor of medicine at UCSF and the director of the Seminole Center for Vulnerable Populations at UCSF. Dr. Kuchel, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'd like to speak a little bit about the effects of the pending eviction crisis on homelessness. As you know, the homelessness crisis has been a crisis for a long time in the United States, and it's primarily a crisis that disproportionately impacts people of color, particularly Black Americans and Indigenous Americans, who are overrepresented in the homeless population by factors of 4 to 8. The homelessness crisis, while often portrayed as a crisis of mental health and substance use, is and has always been a crisis of the devastating lack of affordable housing, of the effects of structural racism, and of income inequality full scale. The COVID crisis has both increased the costs of homelessness, as you may have heard about devastating outbreaks of COVID in congregate shelters, of much more difficulties for people facing homelessness who are not in shelter because of closure of food programs and libraries and other places where people could seek some form of mild relief. And there has been some effort through the federal government to try to solve or bring resources to people currently experiencing homelessness. Many of us, including me, are extremely worried about the other problem and the feeling of that if we focus our efforts on homelessness on people who are currently homeless, it is like it is like trying to bail a leaking ship, because we know that we cannot solve homelessness merely by focusing on the people who are currently homeless. There are current estimates that there will be increases in homelessness on the order of 20 to 40% unless decisive action will be taken through the crises that we're talking about currently. What will happen to families and households when they become evicted? For many, as Emily Benfer noted, that people leave eviction and move to less stable housing. They double up with others. They enter into crowded households. But for many, they fall directly from eviction into homelessness. Or for others, they move into these overcrowded housing where things are unstable, and after a period of a year or two, they eventually fall into homelessness. This is where our concerns lie. Right now, what would happen if you became homeless is more complicated than it's ever been. In about 50% of Americans who are homeless are sheltered. On the West Coast, it's only about a third of people are in shelters when they're homeless. Homeless shelters have become decidedly more worrisome because of the impacts of COVID, and thus many places have really decreased access to shelter. So you see rises in unsheltered homelessness because of the difficulty of having shelters. We worry that there will be dramatic increases in unsheltered homelessness. There have been responses throughout, for instance, California has had a program called Project Room Key, which has provided hotel rooms to individuals who are particularly vulnerable to dying from COVID. This program, though, just to give you a sense of scale, has successfully placed about 15,000 homeless individuals into hotel rooms out of about 150,000 homeless people who already existed in California. The governor of California just announced Project Home Key, which will provide $600 million to try to acquire properties, many of these hotels that are currently being used to provide housing. But again, this will be a drop in the bucket for the people who are currently experiencing homelessness and will not address the new inflows into homelessness. What would it take to end homelessness in this country? It has to be a dramatic expansion of extremely low-income housing, as well as a dramatic expansion of rental support. There is the HEROES Act, which has passed the House but is being held up by the Senate, would provide dramatic rental relief funds, but it is not going through right now. Currently, pre-pandemic, only 1 in 4 households in this country who met the strict criteria for rental relief from the federal government received it because it is a limited resource. The cost to fully fund that is about $31 billion a year. We currently spend about $12 billion on shelter, but we leave most homeless people who are homeless unsheltered. Just again, give you a sense of scale. So I think, being that this is a problem that so disproportionately affects people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous Americans, we anticipate that the eviction crisis will disproportionately impact those communities as well. And we are anticipating at the very worst time we possibly could have dramatic increases in homelessness. I think you're on mute, Sunita.
Dr. Kushel, in our pre-brief, you had talked about the impact to children of being evicted, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Children, and I think Emily's Benfer spoke about it. When children are evicted, they have severe, it causes disruptions in schooling and disruptions in education, mental health problems, et cetera. I will say that family homelessness and sort of the equivalent of homelessness in Latinx populations often looks a little different than it does for single adults, that families often will do everything that they can to avoid showing up in shelter systems or in unsheltered settings because children get removed from households. And so there's a little bit of a definitional issue here where many families who really would be homeless but are not counted as homeless because what they are is living in extraordinarily overcrowded housing situations because those families are doing everything that they can to avoid showing up in the homeless system because of the risk that the children will be removed from the families. We'll say that we are seeing this crisis of COVID very much disproportionately affecting, as you know, Black, Native, and Latinx households. And in Latinx communities, what we're seeing is extraordinary overcrowding of housing. 12 people sharing a room or a bathroom, which is obviously extremely dangerous for purposes of COVID, but may not be counted as homeless because they don't meet the federal definition of homelessness. We see that a lot with households with children, where they will, instead of sort of popping into the shelter system or into the streets, will instead have these extraordinarily overcrowded conditions, which are not safe for COVID, nor are they safe for mental health, emotional health, schooling, or any of the other issues.
Absolutely. Oni Advincula, you had a question.
Yes. We have been seeing a lot of workers who fled from their cities during this pandemic, especially when the cases of infection in these cities like New York in the beginning and now Florida, Texas, and Georgia are rising. Yeah. It is not only a matter of choice for them, but also of safety. Absolutely. Since they have been working from home, essentially their apartments turn into an expensive storage. Yeah. What's the policy if they need to break the lease in the wake of the coronavirus?
The policy to break the lease, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is a very, I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I do think that really brings up the problem, right? That they're not abandoning leases for purposes of choice. They're abandoning it for, in order to save their lives. And I think that is really the heart of why we've been talking about COVID as this crisis within a crisis. We've had such a dire crisis of affordable housing for so long in this country. And that crisis is really, exactly what we can't tolerate with COVID, because it is, in fact, these crowded conditions, whether you're talking about a congregate shelter or whether you're talking about 3 households living in a 2-bedroom apartment, that really is really a life or death issue vis-a-vis COVID.
Absolutely. And Pilar has a very important question. Pilar Marrero.
Hi, hello. I'm wondering, because you mentioned the HEROES Act that is stuck and the Senate doesn't seem interested in taking it up, and the president is not talking about this anymore. So it's solved according to him. So do you see any proposals from the presidential candidates that could address this issue in a future administration? What can we expect if we have a President Biden?
I mean, I think that I'm heartened to see housing being coming onto the agenda in a way that I have not seen it under many other administrations, and to be honest, including Democratic candidates in the past. And that I think that the obviousness of this crisis has sort of increased interest, and I certainly see the Biden campaign is talking about things like the HEROES Act, really rental relief and a dramatic reinvestment in affordable housing. I mean, in this country right now, there are about 35 or 36 units of housing that are available and affordable for every 100 extremely low-income households. Extremely low-income households are households that make 30% or less of the area median income. When you talk about states like California, we're at 23 units per every 100 extremely low-income households. That is why we have the homelessness crisis. And so I think that there have been discussions of not only funding the voucher system, the rental relief, through housing choice vouchers, but also putting more money into the preservation and production and protection of deeply affordable housing.
Dr. Kushel, we have so many more questions for you, but I'm afraid we have to move on. To reporters, we will try to get your questions answered after the call. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments. And we move on to Nisha Vyas. She is the senior attorney at the Western Center for Law and Poverty. Nisha, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. Western Center on Law and Poverty advocates to secure access to housing, healthcare, and public benefits for low-income Californians. So I want to be very clear where this presentation is California-specific, and I am a tenants' rights advocate. So we've talked about the looming eviction crisis as a tsunami, and that metaphor, I think, is intended to capture the magnitude of the crisis. But I want to be really clear that this is not a natural disaster. It will be a disaster of our own making. And the good news about that, though, is that there's nothing inevitable about this crisis. I think, like Emily alluded to earlier, to prevent it, we need to advocate for meaningful governmental intervention. And I won't say that that's easy, but it's something that's going to be necessary if we want to avoid the crisis that is coming towards us pretty fast and furious. So before I describe the current statewide eviction moratorium in California, I'm going to give you a brief background on evictions in California, and then I'll talk about the statewide policies that we're advocating for to prevent mass evictions as the unemployment rates continue to climb and more of California's estimated 17 million renters become unable to pay their rents. So in California, by law, landlords must go through a court process to evict tenants. The process is designed to be very efficient and really to provide consistent results for landlords to be able to eject tenants from and recover their properties. And there's often very little regard for outcome for the tenants. Eviction lawsuits are fast-tracked. Nearly 75% of eviction cases are resolved within 45 days of filing, and nearly 60% of those are resolved within 1 month. So I just want to highlight how quick they are. When a tenant is served with an eviction lawsuit, the tenant has only 5 days to file a response in court or risk losing their case and therefore their homes by default. So in the vast majority of eviction cases, landlords are represented by attorneys, and the vast majority of tenants are not represented. And because of this, even when a tenant has strong defenses to an eviction, if they don't have an attorney, they're more than likely going to lose their case. Now, because evictions proceed so quickly and there are so few resources for low-income tenants to get meaningful help